There's a boundary in ancient records that no one talks about. Before this line, rulers reigned for 30,000 years at a time. After it, they live and die like ordinary men. Before this line, kingship descends from heaven. After it, humans govern themselves. The Sumerian king list, a clay prism sitting in the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford, marks this boundary with a single phrase carved in wedge-shaped script. Then the flood swept over. What follows that sentence is recognizably human history. Kings with believable lifespans, cities we've excavated, names that appear in other ancient texts. But what comes before the flood describes something else entirely. If you enjoy exploring the mysteries hidden in ancient documents, hit that like button and subscribe. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. And, as always, the visuals are here for context. But the real evidence is in the texts themselves, sitting in museums, waiting to be read differently. Let's examine what the oldest historical records actually say. In 1906, a German-American scholar named Hermann Hilprecht published his translation of a cuneiform tablet that had been gathering dust in museum archives. It was called the Veldblundel Prism, excavated from the ruins of Larsa in southern Iraq, and it contained what scholars now call the Sumerian king list. The prism itself is small, about 8 inches tall, made of baked clay, covered on all 4 sides with tiny wedge marks pressed into wet clay over 4,000 years ago. It's not mythology. It's not poetry. It reads like a bureaucratic record, a ledger, the kind of document a royal scribe would maintain to track succession and legitimacy. It begins with a statement that feels almost casual in its enormity. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. Then it lists rulers. Each entry follows the same format. Name, city, length of reign. Alulim of Eridu, 28,800 years. Alalgar of Eridu, 36,000 years. Enmenluana of Bad Tabira, 43,200 years. The scribe continues through 8 kings across 5 cities. No commentary, no explanation. Just names and numbers, recorded with the same administrative precision used for grain inventories and land surveys. The total, carefully tallied, 241,200 years. And then, without ceremony or elaboration, the list states, then the flood swept over. Here's what makes this document impossible to dismiss. After that line about the flood, the king list doesn't end. It continues. New kings, new cities, new dynasties. But now the numbers change. Post-flood rulers reign for 600 years, then 400, then 126, then 90. The reigns shrink rapidly until they reach what historians call credible lengths, the kind of lifespans actual human beings might have. And then the list does something that changes everything. It names Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh, king of Uruk, whose reign the king list records as 126 years. Gilgamesh, whose epic poem is one of humanity's oldest surviving works of literature. Gilgamesh, whose city walls archaeologists have physically excavated. Gilgamesh was real. The Sumerian king list places him in the same document, written by the same scribes, using the same bureaucratic tone as the kings who supposedly ruled for 40,000 years. This creates a problem that mainstream archaeology has never satisfactorily resolved. If the second half of the king list is accepted as legitimate history, and it is, because we can verify its later rulers through independent sources, then why do we automatically dismiss the first half as pure fantasy? Hold that thought. Before we decide what's myth and what's record, let's look at the physical artifact itself. The Weld-Blundell prism sits in the Ashmolean Museum under catalog number AN 1923.444. You can request to see it. You can examine the cuneiform with your own eyes if you make an appointment. The prism dates to approximately 2170 BCE, during the Ur III period, though the list it contains claims to record much older events. It was created during the reign of Utu-Hegal of Uruk, a king whose existence is independently verified through other contemporary inscriptions. The clay was fired hard. The script is clear. The preservation is remarkable for an object 42 centuries old. Hermann Hilprecht wasn't working alone when he published his translation. He was building on decades of Assyriological scholarship, cross-referencing with other cuneiform tablets, verifying his readings against the emerging understanding of Sumerian grammar. This wasn't a fringe text discovered by amateur enthusiasts. This was mainstream academic archaeology, published by the University of Pennsylvania, reviewed by the scholarly community of the early 20th century. And what that scholarly community found was deeply uncomfortable. The prism's format is relentlessly consistent. Each king receives the same treatment: name, city, reign length. There are no variations in formula, no stylistic shifts, no indication that the scribe viewed the pre-flood section as different in nature from the post-flood section. Column 1, side 1 of the prism opens with the divine descent of kingship, then immediately launches into the list. When kingship was lowered from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. In Eridu, Alulim became king. He ruled for 28,800 years. The cuneiform doesn't say the gods tell us, or according to legend. It states this as fact with the same grammatical structure used for every subsequent entry. Alaugar ruled for 36,000 years, and Menluana ruled for 43,200 years. The numbers themselves follow a pattern that scholars have noted but struggle to explain. Almost every pre-flood reign is divisible by 3,600. In Sumerian mathematics, 3,600 was called a sar, a complete cycle, the number of years they associated with certain astronomical periods. Alulim, 28,800 years, Sar 8, Sar Alaugar, 36,000 years, Sar 10 Sar, and Menluana, 43,200 years, 12 Sar. The pattern is not random. It's systematic. The numbers aren't wild exaggerations. They're calculated multiples of a significant mathematical unit. This creates another layer of oddity. If you're inventing mythological rulers to add prestige to your king list, why bother making their reigns conform to mathematical patterns? Why not just say he ruled forever, or he ruled since the beginning of time? The specificity suggests something else: record-keeping, calculation, an attempt to preserve actual chronological data, even if that data describes something we no longer understand. But there's more to these numbers than simple multiples. The Sumerians were obsessed with astronomical cycles. They tracked the movements of Venus with precision that wouldn't be matched again until the telescope. They understood the precession of the equinoxes, the slow wobble of Earth's axis that takes 25,920 years to complete one full cycle. And here's where the numbers get interesting. If you divide the total pre-flood period, 241,200 years, by the precession cycle of 25,920 years, you get approximately 9.3. Not a clean number, but if you consider that the Sumerian mathematical system was base 60, and their astronomical observations were recorded in units called shar, 3,600 years, the numbers start to align with known astronomical phenomena. Some scholars have proposed that these aren't reign lengths at all, but astronomical observations recorded over generations and attributed to the rulers of each period. If 8 successive observation periods, each lasting 1 shar, were recorded, you'd get exactly the kind of numbers we see in the king list. But that's just one interpretation. Another possibility: these numbers represent something we simply don't have context for anymore. A measurement system that made perfect sense to the scribes who recorded it, but whose key we've lost. What we can say with certainty is that the numbers aren't random. They're systematic. They follow mathematical rules. They're preserved with obsessive accuracy across every copy. That level of precision isn't characteristic of mythology. It's characteristic of data preservation. Now watch what happens when we continue through the pre-flood section. After Eridu, the kingship moves to Bad Tibira. The text doesn't explain why. It simply notes the transition as it would note any transfer of power between cities. Then Eridu fell and the kingship was taken to Bad Tibira. This formula, then city fell and the kingship was taken to new city, repeats throughout the entire king list, both before and after the flood. It's the standard notation for dynastic change. In Bad Tibira, 3 more rulers are listed, and Menluana, 43,200 years, and Mengalana, 28,800 years, Dumuzi, the shepherd, 36,000 years. Then the kingship moves to Larak, where one king rules for 28,800 years. Then to Sipar, where another rules for 28,800 years. Then to Shuruppak, where the final pre-flood king, Ubar-Tutu, rules for 18,600 years. 8 kings total, 5 cities, 241,200 years. Then comes the boundary line. Then the flood swept over. The cuneiform phrase is Amaru Ba'ura, literally, the flood it swept over. Short, declarative, no elaboration, no description of divine wrath or cosmic judgment. Just a notation of an event that ended one era and began another. What follows immediately after that phrase is critical to understanding why this text refuses to be dismissed as simple mythology. The king list continues. After the flood had swept over and the kingship had descended from heaven, the kingship was in Kish. Notice, kingship descended from heaven again, as if it had been interrupted, as if it required reinstallation. The language treats this as a restart, not a continuation. The first post-flood dynasty is in Kish, a city about 12 miles east of Babylon. And the very first king listed is Gushur, with a reign of 200 years. Still extraordinary by modern standards, still far longer than human lifespans, but a dramatic reduction from 36,000 years. The second king of Kish reigns for 960 years, the third for 625 years. By the time we reach the 23rd king of this dynasty, reigns have dropped to 36 years, perfectly normal for a human ruler. The pattern continues across subsequent dynasties. The first dynasty of Uruk lists Meshki-Angashar with 324 years, his son Enmerkar with 420 years, then Lugalbanda with 1,200 years, and then Gilgamesh with 126 years. 126 years is still longer than typical human lifespan, but it's within the realm of exaggeration that ancient chroniclers might apply to legendary heroes. More importantly, Gilgamesh represents the point where the king list intersects with archaeology. The city of Uruk is one of the most extensively excavated sites in Mesopotamia. The German Archaeological Institute has been working there since the 1850s. They've found the city walls attributed to Gilgamesh. They've found administrative tablets from his period. They've found evidence of a major building program in the exact time frame the king list places him. Gilgamesh is in the archaeological record, and the king list places him exactly where he belongs chronologically, as part of the first dynasty of Uruk, following rulers whose reign lengths gradually decreased from impossible to merely improbable to historically credible. By the third dynasty of Ur, around 2100 BCE, the king list is recording reigns of 7 years, 18 years, 15 years. These are numbers that match perfectly with contemporary inscriptions, royal seals, and administrative documents. The later portion of the king list is accepted as accurate history because we can verify it. Kings like Ur-Nammu, Shulgi, and Amar-Sin appear in thousands of administrative tablets, building inscriptions, and legal documents. The king list got the later section right. Perfectly right. Which brings us back to the uncomfortable question. Why would scribes maintain a document that's half accurate history and half complete fabrication, without ever indicating the difference? Here's what makes the question even more uncomfortable. The Weld-Blundell prism isn't unique. This is not a single clay object that could be dismissed as the work of one confused or creative scribe. Fragments and complete copies of the Sumerian king list have been found in multiple locations across ancient Mesopotamia. The University of California, Berkeley, holds a tablet fragment catalogued as UCBC 9-1819. It's older than the Weld-Blundell prism by at least a century, dating to the Ur-Thruj period around 2100 BCE, and it contains the same pre-flood kings with the same impossible reign lengths. Another version, held at the Oriental Institute in Chicago, was excavated from Nippur, one of Sumer's most important religious centers. Same kings, same structure, same boundary at the flood. The Louvre in Paris holds fragments. The British Museum holds fragments. Istanbul holds fragments. At least 16 different tablets or fragments of the king list have been recovered from various archaeological sites. They span a period of over 200 years in their creation. They come from different cities: Larsa, Ur, Isin, Nippur. And here's the critical detail. They agree. The pre-flood section appears in every version that preserves that portion of the text. The king names are consistent. The reign lengths are consistent, with only minor variations that appear to be copying errors, not substantive differences. Alulim is always listed first, always from Eridu, always with a reign of 28,800 years. The sequence of cities is always the same: Eridu, Bad Tabira, Larak, Sippar, Shuruppak. The flood boundary is always present. This is not one scribe's invention. This is a standardized record, preserved and copied across generations, treated by ancient scholars as important enough to maintain with careful accuracy. Why? If these are obvious fictions, why did scribes from different cities, working centuries apart, all preserve the same obvious fictions with such precision? The standard scholarly explanation is that this was political propaganda. Ancient kings wanted to connect themselves to divine authority, so they invented long king lists that stretched back to when kingship descended from heaven. But that explanation has problems. First, propaganda is usually flexible. Different regions invent different origin stories to suit their political needs. Yet the Sumerian king list remains remarkably consistent across competing city-states. Nippur and Larsa and Ur all preserved the same pre-flood sequence, even though they were political rivals at various points. Second, if the goal was simply to create impressive antiquity, why include the flood boundary at all? Why not claim continuous rule from the divine beginning straight through to the present? The flood represents a break, a discontinuity, moment when the system failed and had to restart. That's not great propaganda. Third, and most importantly, why maintain the impossible numbers? If you want to connect your dynasty to ancient legitimacy, you could claim descent from Alulim or Ulalgar without claiming they ruled for 28,800 years. You could keep the names, which provide the prestigious connection to antiquity, while adjusting the reigns to something remotely plausible. But they didn't. Every copy maintains those enormous numbers. 28,800 years, 36,000 years, 43,200 years. The scribes' faithfully preserved figures that they must have known would seem absurd, unless the numbers themselves were the point, unless the numbers were data that the scribes felt obligated to preserve accurately, even though they no longer understood what those numbers measured. Think about this. The Sumerians invented writing. They invented mathematics. They invented complex astronomy. They were capable of sophisticated record-keeping. What if the pre-flood section isn't mythology at all? What if it's a degraded record, ancient data copied and recopied by scribes who no longer understood the original measurement system, but who knew the numbers were important enough to preserve exactly? What if 28,800 years doesn't mean 28,800 solar years as we measure them, but something else entirely? What if the Sumerian year meant something different before the flood than it did after? We know that ancient cultures used different calendar systems. The Sumerian calendar was complex. They tracked both lunar months and solar years, and periodically had to reconcile the two. Their mathematics was base 60, not base 10 like ours. What if the pre-flood years were measured in different units, lunar cycles, or seasonal markers, or some other astronomical period, and later scribes, no longer understanding the original system, simply copied the numbers forward without conversion? That's speculation. But it's speculation that takes the evidence seriously instead of dismissing it. Here's what we know for certain. Ancient scribes preserved these numbers with extreme care across centuries. They treated the king list as important historical documentation, not recreational mythology. And they placed verified archaeological history in the same document with the same format as the pre-flood section, suggesting they viewed it as the same type of information. Now, let's look at what the text actually says happened at the boundary. The cuneiform phrase, "then the flood swept over," is stark in its brevity. No explanation, no cause given, no description of divine anger or human wickedness or cosmic judgment. Just, the flood swept over. And then, kingship descended from heaven again. The language is fascinating because it's so bureaucratic. This reads like an administrative note. Operations suspended due to flood event. Operations resumed in Kish under new management. There's no moralizing. The pre-flood kings aren't described as wicked. The flood isn't described as punishment. The post-flood kings aren't described as more righteous or deserving. It's just a chronological marker. Before the flood, this system. After the flood, this new system. The matter-of-fact tone is, in its own way, more unsettling than if this were written as dramatic mythology. Myths explain. Myths provide meaning and moral lessons. Myths tell you why things happened. This doesn't. This just records that something happened. A boundary was crossed. One era ended. Another began. The post-flood section continues for dozens of dynasties, hundreds of kings, covering over 1,000 years of recorded history. It tracks the rise and fall of Kish, Uruk, Ur, Awan, Hamazi, and more. It records wars, conquests, destructions, and restorations, and it maintains the same dry, ledger-like format throughout. When Kish is defeated, the text states, "Then Kish was defeated, and the kingship was taken to Eanna. When Eanna falls, kingship moves to Uruk. When Uruk falls, to Ur. The formula never changes. Cities rise, cities fall, kingship transfers. The scribe records each transition with the same administrative precision used for everything else in the document. By the time we reach the third dynasty of Ur, the period when the Weld-Blundell prism itself was created, the king list has become a comprehensive chronicle of Mesopotamian political history. Every city-state, every dynasty, every transfer of power meticulously documented. And sitting at the beginning of that comprehensive chronicle, before the flood boundary, are 8 kings with impossible reigns. Not hidden in some separate mythology, not in a different text, not in a different format. Right there at the start of the historical ledger, recorded with the same care as everything that follows. This is the essential strangeness of the Sumerian king list. It refuses to be easily categorized. It's not pure mythology. The later sections are verifiable history. It's not pure history. The early sections describe the impossible. It's not propaganda. It's too consistent across competing political entities. It's not religious literature. It lacks theological explanation or moral framing. It's a record, a bureaucratic document, a king list, and it marks a boundary that ancient scribes clearly considered significant enough to preserve across centuries, the moment when the flood swept over and human-scale history began. Now here's what creates the next problem. The Sumerian king list isn't describing events that left no trace. The 5 cities listed in the pre-flood section, Eridu, Bad Tabira, Lirak, Sippar, and Shuruppak, are all real places that archaeologists have excavated. They're not mythological locations like Atlantis or El Dorado. They're actual ancient cities in southern Iraq, with documented occupation layers, pottery sequences, and building remains. Eridu is considered the oldest city in Sumer. Archaeological excavations have uncovered 18 successive temple platforms, the earliest dating to around 5400 BCE. The site shows continuous occupation and rebuilding over thousands of years. Bad Tabira has been identified with the modern site of Tel al-Madain. Excavations show occupation from the Ubaid period through the early dynastic period. Shuruppak is modern Tel Farah. When German archaeologists excavated it in 1902 and 1903, they found something remarkable: a thick layer of flood silt separating the lower occupation levels from the upper ones. A physical flood layer. At the city, the king list names as the last pre-flood capital. So the cities are real. The flood is real, archaeologically documented. The post-flood kings are real, verified through multiple sources. What exactly are we calling mythological? The reign lengths? Certainly, those seem impossible. But is the solution to declare the entire pre-flood section fictional, or to acknowledge that we might not understand what those numbers actually measure? The concept of kingship descending from heaven? We'll examine that phrase more carefully, but it's worth noting that it's a formula, and formulas in ancient texts often have specific technical meanings we've lost. The fact that human history seems to begin abruptly, but archaeology shows something similar. Sophisticated civilization appearing in Mesopotamia with surprising suddenness, without clear developmental phases leading up to it. This is where the forensic approach requires intellectual honesty. We can't simply dismiss evidence because it's inconvenient. We have to acknowledge what the ancient records actually say, note where they correspond with physical evidence, and recognize where we encounter mysteries we cannot currently explain. The Sumerian king list says there was a before. It says kingship, governance, administration, civilization existed before the flood. It says that civilization was interrupted. It says that after the interruption, kingship was lowered from heaven again, and human history resumed, but in a different form. And it records this in the same bureaucratic ledger that accurately tracks the next 1,000 years of Mesopotamian political history. That's not mythology in the usual sense. That's something else. Something that made ancient scribes careful enough to preserve impossible numbers across centuries. Something that marks a boundary those scribes clearly considered real. Something that divides an era we can verify from an era we don't understand. The question isn't whether we believe in 2,800-year reigns. The question is, what historical memory is encoded in this document? What information were ancient scribes preserving with such care? And what happened at that boundary, the moment when the flood swept over, and human history, as we recognize it, began? Hold that thought, because we're not done examining the text itself. The king list contains other oddities that deserve attention. Small details that suggest this document is recording something more complex than simple political propaganda or creative mythology. For instance, the pre-flood kings aren't all given the same generic titles. The 8th king, Ubar-Tutu of Shuruppak, is specifically identified as the father of Ziusudra. Ziusudra is the Sumerian Noah, the flood survivor. His story is told in other Sumerian texts, including the fragmentary Eridu Genesis and the more complete Instructions of Shuruppak. The king list doesn't tell his flood story. It just notes his parentage, linking the pre-flood era directly to the flood survivor, who then connects to the post-flood world. That's a narrative structure that suggests the text's purpose isn't just to establish antiquity for later kings, but to maintain a chronological framework that spans the discontinuity. Another detail. 3 of the pre-flood cities appear again in the post-flood section as important political centers. Eridu, Bad Tabira, and Sippar all have post-flood dynasties or significant mentions. If these were simply invented mythological locations, why reuse them in the historical section? The pattern suggests these cities had actual historical significance that predated the flood and continued after it, exactly what the king list claims. The text also shows awareness of its own impossible claims. When listing the first dynasty of Kish, immediately post-flood, the scribe notes that the total of all 23 kings' reigns is 24,510 years, 3 months, and 3 days. That's an absurdly precise false precision. But it's also characteristic of scribal methodology, adding up figures to show the mathematical completeness of the record. The scribe is treating these numbers as data to be calculated, not as symbolic or metaphorical statements. Even more telling, later Mesopotamian scribes continued to reference the king list as authoritative. Legal documents from the Isin-Larsa period cite the king list to establish chronological precedents. Temple records use it to date the founding of religious institutions. Royal inscriptions reference it to legitimize dynastic claims. For over 1,000 years after the earliest versions were compiled, Mesopotamian scholars treated the Sumerian king list as a reliable historical source, not a religious text, not a creation myth, a historical source. They knew the pre-flood section existed. They had the same access to those impossible numbers that we do, and they still used the document as factual reference. What did they understand that we don't? The possibilities are limited. Either ancient scribes across a millennium were all gullible enough to believe in 2800-year reigns, which seems unlikely, given their sophisticated mathematical and astronomical knowledge. Or they understood something about how to read those numbers that we've lost. Or they considered the pre-flood section important for reasons other than chronological accuracy, but important enough to preserve without alteration. Any of those options suggests we should approach the text with more nuance than simple dismissal. There's one more aspect of the king list that deserves attention before we move forward. What it doesn't say. It doesn't explain where the pre-flood kings came from. It doesn't describe their appearance, their powers, their divine nature, if they had one. It doesn't tell us what they did during those impossibly long reigns. It just lists them. Name, city, length of reign, over and over. This is radically different from mythological literature. The Epic of Gilgamesh, by contrast, tells us everything: Gilgamesh's parentage, his appearance, his personality, his adventures, his flaws, his friendships, his existential crisis. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, describes cosmic battles between gods, the formation of the earth from a goddess's corpse, the creation of humans from divine blood. Those are mythologies. They explain, they characterize, they dramatize. The king list does none of that. It's a list, a bare-bones administrative record. And perhaps that's the most telling detail of all, because if you wanted to create an impressive mythological origin for your civilization, you wouldn't write it like this. You'd write it like Enuma Elish, dramatic, cosmic, meaningful. But if you were a scribe copying ancient records that you didn't fully understand, records that needed to be preserved because they were considered historically important, you'd write it exactly like this, carefully, precisely, without embellishment, maintaining the original data even when it didn't make sense. The Sumerian king list reads like degraded documentation, like a database that's been copied forward through system migrations until the field names no longer match the data they contain, but the data itself is preserved because someone, somewhere, knows it's important. And that database marks a boundary. Before this point, one system. After this point, another system. At the boundary, the flood swept over. We have the artifact, 8 inches of baked clay, 42 centuries old, sitting in Oxford. We have the copies, fragments in museums across the world. We have the excavated cities. We have the flood layers. We have the verified post-flood kings. What we don't have is a satisfactory explanation for why this particular document, in this particular format, preserves this particular sequence of information. Not yet. but we're going to keep examining the evidence. Because the Weld Blundell prism isn't the only artifact that marks this boundary. It's not the only text that describes a before and an after. The pattern is larger than one king list, and when patterns repeat across independent sources, that's when forensic analysis gets interesting. So let's establish what we know with certainty. There is a boundary in the ancient records. That boundary is marked by a flood event. Before the flood, rulers with impossible reigns in verified cities. After the flood, human scale history that archaeology confirms. The question that remains is simple. What happened at that boundary? What changed so fundamentally that scribes across 1,000 years felt obligated to preserve the record of the change, even when the record itself described the impossible? That's what we're going to examine next. But before we move forward, it's worth sitting with the strangeness of what we've already seen. A clay prism, a bureaucratic ledger, a list of kings that spans from the impossible to the verified, without ever changing tone or format. A flood boundary that marks the moment when human history, as we understand it, begins. And ancient scribes who preserved it all, the impossible and the historical together, as if they understood something we've forgotten about how to read their records. The artifact is real. The cities are real. The flood is real. The post-flood history is real. Now watch what happens when we find the other copies. So we have one document, the Weld Blundell prism, a single clay artifact that could theoretically be dismissed as the work of one scribe with unusual ideas about the past. Except it's not one document. In 1911, just 5 years after Hilprecht published the Weld Blundell prism, another fragment surfaced. Catalogued as UCBC 9-1819, it's now held at the Bancroft Library at the University of California, Berkeley. The fragment is smaller than the Weld Blundell prism, only about 4 inches tall, with significant damage. But what remains is legible, and what it contains is identical to the Weld Blundell version. Same pre-flood kings, same cities, same reign lengths. The Berkeley fragment is older than the Weld Blundell prism by at least a century. It dates to the Ur III period, around 2100 BCE. It was created in a different city, by a different scribe, working under a different dynasty, and it preserves exactly the same pre-flood sequence, a lulim of Eridu, 28,800 years. The numbers match, the names match, the order matches. This creates a problem for the creative mythology explanation. 2 scribes, separated by a century and working in different political contexts, don't independently invent the same elaborate pre-flood history with the same impossible reign lengths unless they're both working from a common source. A common source they both considered authoritative enough to copy faithfully. But it doesn't stop with 2 copies. Between 1889 and 1900, the University of Pennsylvania excavated at Nippur, one of ancient Sumer's most important religious centers. Nippur was never a major political capital, but it was the sacred city of Enlil, the chief deity of the Sumerian pantheon. Kings competed for legitimacy by controlling Nippur. Among the thousands of tablets recovered from Nippur's temple and scribal school complexes, archaeologists found multiple fragments of the Sumerian king list, multiple fragments, from the same city, from different archaeological contexts spanning centuries, and they all contain the same pre-flood section. By the 1960s, when Thorkild Jacobsen published his comprehensive analysis of all known Sumerian king list sources, he had identified at least 16 different tablets or fragments from various excavations, 16 copies, from Larsa, Ur, Isen, Nippur, and other sites, created over a span of more than 200 years, from roughly 2200 BCE to 2000 BCE. They're not identical in every detail. Some are damaged. Some contain variations in spelling. Some include additional dynasty names or alternate versions of certain sections. But the core, pre-flood sequence remains remarkably stable across all versions. Every copy that preserves the pre-flood section lists the same 8 kings in the same 5 cities with essentially the same reign lengths. The variations that do exist are minor, the kind of small differences you'd expect from copying errors or regional dialect differences, not substantive contradictions. When Ululim appears, he's always first, always from Eridu, always with a reign measured in the tens of thousands of years. When Alalgar appears, he's always second, always from Eridu, always with a similar enormous reign. The pattern holds across every fragment. This level of consistency across independent copies created in different cities by different scribes over 2 centuries suggests something important. There was a standard text, a master version that scribes in different locations were all working from, a version that predated all the copies we've found, a version that was considered authoritative enough that scribes felt obligated to reproduce it accurately, even the parts that described the impossible. Now, here's what makes this even more significant. Nippur, where multiple fragments were found, was primarily a religious and educational center. The tablets come from the Aduba, the scribal school. Young scribes learning their profession copied the king list as part of their education. They copied it as history, not as a creative writing exercise, not as mythology to be reinterpreted, as historical reference material that future administrators would need to know. Among the Nippur tablets are curriculum texts, catalogs of the standard works that scribes were expected to master. The Sumerian king list appears on these curriculum lists alongside mathematical tables, legal precedents, and administrative procedures. It was taught as factual reference material. The scribes of Nippur had access to extensive libraries. They had astronomical texts, mathematical treatises, medical knowledge, and literary works. They knew the difference between mythology and documentation, and they categorized the king list as documentation, which raises an uncomfortable question. What did they know about how to read it that we don't? But let's go further, because the Sumerian king list isn't even the earliest reference to this pre-flood period. In 278 BCE, more than 18 centuries after the earliest king list fragments, a Babylonian priest named Berossus wrote a history of Babylon in Greek for the Seleucid king Antiochus III. The work, called Babylonica, survives only in fragments quoted by later Greek and Roman historians, like Josephus, Eusebius, and Syncellus. But those fragments preserve Berossus's account of Babylonian history back to its earliest periods. And Berossus describes 10 antediluvian kings, not 8, like the Sumerian king list. 10. The number is different. Some of the names are different. They've been filtered through Akkadian into Greek, so they're spelled differently. But the structure is identical. 10 kings ruling before the flood, each with impossibly long reigns. Total time period, 432,000 years. Then a great flood destroys civilization. Then kingship is re-established, and human history resumes with believable reign lengths, the exact same before-after pattern. What makes Berossus especially significant is his audience. He wasn't writing for Mesopotamians who might have cultural reasons to preserve local traditions. He was writing in Greek for Greek-speaking scholars in the Hellenistic period. His readers were educated people who would have questioned obvious absurdities. They had Greek philosophical traditions, historical methodology, skeptical inquiry. They weren't a gullible audience. And Berossus presents the antediluvian kings as historical fact, not mythology. He explicitly states that he's working from temple archives in Babylon, official records, not oral tradition. He's claiming documentary evidence for the pre-flood period. More importantly, Berossus's account shows that the pre-flood tradition wasn't just preserved in Sumerian texts from the 3rd millennium BCE. It was still considered legitimate history in Babylon in the 3rd century BCE, 2,000 years later. Scholars and priests across 2 millennia maintained this record of a before time, a flood boundary, and an after time. They preserved it through the fall of Sumerian civilization, through the rise of Akkad, through Babylonian and Assyrian empires, through Persian conquest, into the Hellenistic period. For 2,000 years, this pattern remained in the official historical record. That's not cultural mythology that evolved and changed with each telling. That's institutional memory, maintained with careful precision across political upheavals, language changes, and cultural transformations. Now, watch what happens when we look beyond Mesopotamia. In Egypt, the Turin king list, also called the Turin royal canon, dates to the reign of Rameses II, around 1250 BCE. It's a papyrus scroll listing the pharaohs of Egypt in chronological order. The papyrus is damaged, with significant sections missing. But what survives is revealing. Before the human pharaohs, the Turin king list records the Shemsuhor, the followers or companions of Horus. These are semi-divine rulers whose reigns are measured in thousands of years. Before them are the Neteru, the gods themselves, whose reigns stretch even further back. Then comes the first dynasty of unified Egypt under Narmer, around 3100 BCE, and the reigns become human scale, normal lengths, historically verifiable kings, the same before-after structure. Divine or semi-divine rulers with impossible reigns, followed by a transition point, followed by human history. The Palermo stone, another Egyptian artifact, follows the same pattern. It's a basalt stele originally about 2 meters long, now broken into fragments held in various museums. It dates to the 5th dynasty, around 2400 BCE. The Palermo stone lists the pre-dynastic rulers of Egypt before Narmer unified the country. Their reign lengths are unclear because of how the stone is damaged and how the dating system is marked, but they're distinct from the dynastic pharaohs who follow. Then Narmer appears, First Dynasty begins, and we enter verifiable history. Egypt had no contact with Sumer when these records were created. The civilizations developed independently. They used different writing systems, different languages, different religious frameworks, yet both preserved the same pattern, an age before current history, when rulers were different, followed by a transition, followed by recognizable human governance. This creates a problem. If the Sumerian king list was just Mesopotamian political propaganda, why does Egypt have the same structure? If it's just mythology unique to one culture, why do multiple cultures share the framework? Let's go further. In Hindu tradition, the Puranas, ancient Sanskrit texts compiled over many centuries, describe cyclical ages called yugas. The first age, Satya Yuga, is the Golden Age. Humans live 100,000 years. Righteousness prevails. The gods interact directly with mankind. Then comes Treta Yuga, where lifespans drop to 10,000 years. Then Dwapara Yuga, with lifespans around 1,000 years. Then Kali Yuga, our current age, where humans live around 100 years. The transition between these ages is marked by catastrophes. Multiple Puranas describe a great flood that ends previous ages and begins new ones. The Satapatha Brahmana, one of the older Vedic texts, tells the story of Manu, who survives a great flood with the help of a fish who warns him to build a boat. After the flood, Manu becomes the progenitor of the new human race. It's the same pattern again, long lifespans in earlier ages, a flood boundary, shorter lifespans after the boundary, human history beginning in earnest after the discontinuity. The Hindu texts were compiled in India, developing independently from both Mesopotamian and Egyptian traditions. Different language family, different religious concepts, different geographic context. Same before, after structure. Now, consider the Hebrew Scriptures. Genesis chapter 5 lists the genealogy from Adam to Noah. The patriarchs have extraordinary lifespans. Adam, 930 years, Seth, 912 years, Enosh, 905 years, Kenan, 910 years, Mahalalel, 895 years, Jared, 962 years, Enoch, 365 years, taken by God, didn't die, Methuselah, 969 years, Lamech, 777 years, Noah, 950 years. Then comes the flood. Genesis chapters 6 through 9 describe the flood in detail, God's decision to send it, Noah's construction of the ark, the flooding of the earth, the survival of Noah's family and the animals, the recession of the waters. After the flood, Genesis chapter 11 lists Noah's descendants. And their lifespans begin dropping rapidly. Shem, Noah's son, 600 years, Arphaxad, 438 years, Shelah, 433 years, Eber, 464 years, Peleg, 239 years, Ru, 239 years, Serug, 230 years, Nahor, 148 years, Terah, 205 years, Abraham, 175 years. By Abraham, we're approaching normal human lifespans. By King David, about 800 years after Abraham, lifespans are entirely normal. David dies at 70 years old. The pattern is identical to the Sumerian king list. Pre-flood, extreme lifespans. Post-flood, exponential decline toward human normal lengths. The boundary, a catastrophic flood. Genesis was compiled from multiple earlier sources, but scholarly consensus dates the earliest written versions to around 600 to 500 BCE, though the oral traditions are certainly older. The Hebrew patriarchs and the Sumerian kings aren't the same people. The theological frameworks are completely different, but the chronological structure is identical. Before the flood, long-lived rulers. After the flood, progressively shorter reigns leading to normal history. Now, let's do something even more remarkable. Let's leave the old world entirely. The Popol Vuh is the creation epic of the Quiche Maya people of Guatemala. The surviving text was written in the 16th century, but it records much older oral traditions that predate European contact. The Popol Vuh describes multiple creations. The gods create humanity several times, and each creation fails and is destroyed. The first creation produces beings made of mud who cannot speak or remember. They're destroyed. The second creation produces wooden people who have no hearts, no minds, no memory of their creators. A great flood is sent to destroy them. The text describes how the face of the earth was darkened and a black rain began to fall. The third creation finally produces humans as we are now, made of maize, able to speak, able to remember, able to worship. This creation succeeds. Human history begins. The Mayan long count calendar, developed around 400 BCE, marks current human history as beginning in 3114 BCE, interestingly close to the date when Mesopotamian and Egyptian civilizations show archaeological evidence of sudden advancement. But the point is the pattern. Previous ages ended by water. Current age inhabited by current humanity. Clear before, after boundary. The Maya had no contact with Mesopotamia, Egypt, India, or the Hebrew world when these traditions developed. The Atlantic Ocean separated them. They developed writing independently. Their religious concepts were entirely their own. Yet they preserved the same structural pattern. Previous ages of non-current inhabitants ended by flood, followed by current humanity. This is where the forensic approach requires us to confront an uncomfortable possibility. One culture having a flood story could be coincidence or local memory of a regional flood event. Two cultures could be explained by cultural diffusion, trade, migration, conquest, spreading stories. But when cultures separated by oceans and millennia, developing independently with no contact, all preserve the same specific pattern, not just a flood, but long-lived different rulers, then flood, then normal humanity. We're looking at something else. Either this is the most improbable coincidence in anthropological history, or these cultures are all preserving degraded memories of the same event sequence. And if they're preserving memories of the same sequence, then that sequence happened. Not necessarily the way any individual culture describes it. Memories degrade over time. Stories change with retelling. Theological interpretations overlay historical events. But the core pattern, the before-after structure with a water boundary, appears too consistently across too many independent sources to be pure invention. Something happened. Something significant enough that cultures worldwide preserved the memory of it, even as they lost the details, even as the timescales became garbled, even as the nature of the before became increasingly mythologized. A boundary was crossed. One era ended, another began. And on both sides of that boundary, civilization existed, but in different forms. Now let's return to the cuneiform tablets, because there's another layer to this that makes the pattern even more specific. The Eridu Genesis, also called the Sumerian flood story, is preserved on a tablet catalogued as CBS 1-673 at the University of Pennsylvania Museum. It dates to around 1600 BCE, but it's clearly a copy of much older material. The tablet is damaged, with significant portions missing, but what survives describes the period before the flood in surprisingly concrete terms. It lists 5 cities. After the kingship descended from heaven: Eridu, Bad Tabaira, Larak, Sippar, and Shuruppak. The exact same 5 cities as the king list, in the exact same order. But the Eridu Genesis isn't a king list. It's a narrative text. It describes these cities as functioning, populated places. It mentions the gods establishing divine offices and assigning roles. It describes civilization existing, operating, flourishing. Then it describes the gods deciding to send a flood. The god Enki warns Ziusudra, who builds a boat and survives. After the flood, the text describes kingship being restored, not established for the first time, restored, as if it had existed before and was being reinstated. The language matters. Restored implies continuity across the discontinuity. Something that existed before the flood is being brought back after the flood. This matches the king list's phrase. After the flood had swept over, and kingship had descended from heaven, the kingship was in Kish, descended again, as if it had been removed and was being returned. The Atrahasis epic, preserved in Old Babylonian tablets from around 1800 BCE, provides even more detail about the pre-flood world. Atrahasis describes a functioning civilization with administrative structures, labor organization, and complex social hierarchies. It mentions the Anunnaki, we'll examine that term in detail later, as judges and administrators. The epic states that 1 to 200 years pass during which humans labor for the gods. Then the gods decide humanity has become too numerous and noisy. They send the flood to reduce the population. Atrahasis, the Akkadian name for Ziusudra, is warned by the god Ea, Akkadian name for Enki. He builds a boat with specific dimensions described in cubits. He loads it with his family, various animals, and grain. The flood comes. The text describes 7 days and 7 nights of rain. Then the waters recede. Atrahasis survives and makes sacrifice. The gods regret their decision and establish a new covenant with humanity. What's striking about Atrahasis is how specific and material it is. This isn't cosmic mythology about the creation of the universe. It's a historical chronicle about a functioning civilization that was destroyed and then rebuilt. The text even provides a timeline, 1,200 years. Now, 1,200 years is still far longer than the historical period it's describing. Archaeology doesn't support continuous civilization in Mesopotamia for 1,200 years before the earliest flood layers. But it's dramatically shorter than the 241,200 years the king list assigns to the pre-flood period. This suggests that different texts are using different chronological frameworks, but all agreeing that there was a substantial pre-flood period of organized civilization. The consistency is what matters. Text after text from Mesopotamia describes the same sequence. 1. Civilization exists before flood. 2. It's organized, administered, populated. 3. It's associated with these specific 5 cities. 4. A flood destroys it. 5. Civilization is rebuilt afterward. 6. Kingship is restored or descends again. That's not vague mythology. That's a historical claim being made repeatedly across different texts, different time periods, and different literary genres. The king list makes it as a bureaucratic ledger. The Eridu Genesis makes it as a narrative. Atrahasis makes it as an epic poem. Berossus makes it as scholarly history. Different genres, different purposes, same basic chronology. And that chronology is corroborated by actual flood layers found at Uruk, Ur, and other sites. Thick deposits of water-laid silt separating lower occupation levels from upper ones, physical evidence of catastrophic flooding in southern Mesopotamia during the late 4th or early 3rd millennium BCE. The archaeology doesn't prove 40,000-year rains, but it proves the flood. And it proves that the cities listed as pre-flood capitals are real places with real pre-flood occupation. So we're left with a pattern that refuses to disappear, multiple copies of the king list, all preserving the same pre-flood sequence, multiple narrative texts corroborating the same 5 cities and the same flood boundary. A Babylonian priest in the Hellenistic period still treating this as legitimate history. Egyptian, Hindu, Hebrew, and Mayan traditions all showing the same before-after structure. And physical evidence of actual floods at the actual cities in approximately the right time period. This is not easily dismissed as pure fiction. It's also not easily accepted as literal fact. The reign lengths remain impossible. The timescales don't match archaeology. The mechanism of kingship descending from heaven isn't explained in material terms we can verify. But what we can say with confidence is that ancient scribes across multiple cultures were recording something they considered historically real. A boundary, a discontinuity, a transition from one form of civilization to another, and they went to extraordinary lengths to preserve the record of that transition, even when the numbers describing it seemed absurd. The question is no longer, did ancient people believe this? They clearly did, for thousands of years, across multiple literate civilizations, with careful preservation of specific details. The question is, what were they remembering? What institutional memory was being maintained in these texts? What actual historical event or transition was being documented in increasingly garbled form as the distance from the event grew? And why, if this was pure fantasy, would scribes continue to preserve the exact same fantasy with the exact same impossible numbers when they could have easily adjusted it to make it more believable? The numbers themselves might be the key, not as literal years, but as encoded information about something else. The Sumerians were sophisticated astronomers and mathematicians. They tracked planetary cycles, lunar phases, stellar precessions. What if the years in the king list aren't solar years, but some other unit? Lunar months, seasonal markers, astronomical cycles. 28 out of 800 could be 28 out of 800 lunar months, which equals 2,400 solar years, still longer than human lifespans, but approaching the realm where it could describe dynastic periods rather than individual reigns. 36,000 lunar months equals 3,000 solar years. 43,200 lunar months equals 3,600 solar years. Suddenly, we're in time frames that match archaeological evidence for the Ubaid period in Mesopotamia, the sophisticated culture that predated Sumerian civilization and mysteriously declined around 3800 BCE, just before the sudden emergence of complex Sumerian civilization around 3500 BCE. That's speculation. But it's speculation that takes the numbers seriously instead of dismissing them. It asks, what could these numbers represent if we're willing to consider that the scribes were recording data, not inventing mythology? Because here's what we know for certain. Ancient scribes preserved these numbers with obsessive accuracy across centuries. They had every opportunity to adjust them, to make them more believable, to edit them for propaganda purposes. They didn't. They copied 28,800 years and 36,000 years, and 43,200 years over and over, generation after generation, city after city, even as they must have known those numbers would seem impossible to any rational reader. They preserved the data, which suggests the data itself was the point, not the interpretation of the data that may have been lost. But the raw numbers, the sequence, the pattern, that had to be maintained exactly. And when data is preserved that carefully for that long, across that many independent sources, it's usually because someone somewhere knows that data is important, even if no one remembers exactly why anymore. The Sumerian king list isn't an isolated oddity. It's part of a web of corroborating evidence from multiple independent sources, textual, archaeological, and cross-cultural. That web doesn't prove what happened before the flood, but it proves that the ancient world considered before the flood to be real, a distinct era with distinct characteristics, an era that ended and was succeeded by the era we can historically verify. The boundary exists in the records. The flood exists in the archaeology. The cities exist in excavations. The post-flood kings exist in verified history. What comes before the boundary, that's still the mystery. But it's a mystery that multiple ancient civilizations insisted was worth remembering, worth preserving, worth teaching to the next generation as factual history. And that should make us pause before dismissing it entirely, because either all these cultures were wrong about their own past, independently, consistently wrong in the exact same way, or they were recording something real that we've lost the context to understand. The tablets sit in museums. The cuneiform hasn't changed. The pattern remains exactly where ancient scribes placed it. 16 copies of the king list, multiple narrative texts, Egyptian king lists, Hindu Puranas, Hebrew genealogies, Mayan creation accounts, all marking the same boundary, all describing the same transition, all insisting human history as we know it began after something else ended. Now, let's examine what the language itself tells us about that something else. Let's examine the cross-cultural pattern more deeply, because the parallels become even more specific when we look at the details. The Egyptian Turin king list doesn't just mention pre-dynastic rulers. It provides specific information about them. The papyrus, though damaged, preserves enough to show that these pre-dynastic rulers were organized into dynasties, just like the human pharaohs that followed. The souls of Pi and souls of Nekhen aren't vague mythological concepts. Pi and Nekhen were real cities in pre-dynastic Egypt, Pe in the Delta region, Nekhen in Upper Egypt. These were actual political centers that existed before the unification of Egypt under Narmer. And the Turin list treats the souls, or followers, associated with these cities the same way it treats later pharaohs. It lists them in sequence. It attributes reign lengths to them. It treats them as part of the political succession of Egypt. The term Shem-Su-Hor literally means followers of Horus. In Egyptian theology, Horus was the divine king, the god associated with legitimate rulership. The pharaohs themselves were considered the living embodiment of Horus, so followers of Horus could be read as those who ruled under divine authority, which maps precisely onto the Sumerian concept of En, the divinely appointed administrators. The linguistic parallel isn't perfect. Egypt and Sumer had completely different languages and religious systems, but the conceptual parallel is striking. Both cultures distinguish between rulers who held office through direct divine connection and rulers who held office through human political authority. And both cultures place the transition from one type of rulership to the other at a specific point in their chronology. Now, let's look at the Hindu tradition more carefully, because the Puranas provide even more specific details about the transition between ages. The Matsya Purana, one of the oldest of the 18 major Puranas, describes how Manu survives the flood, but it also provides detailed chronology. The text states that the Satya Yuga lasted 1,728,000 years, the Treta Yuga lasted 1,236,000 years, the Dwapara Yuga lasted 864,000 years, and the current Kali Yuga will last 432,000 years. Those numbers follow a precise mathematical pattern. 4.3.2.1. The ages aren't random lengths, they're calculated ratios. And here's where it gets interesting. 432,000 years is exactly the number Berossus gives for the total pre-flood period in Mesopotamia. Not approximately, exactly. The Babylonian priest writing in Greek for a Hellenistic audience, and the Hindu Puranas compiled in India use the identical number for the pre-human period. These traditions had no contact. The Puranas weren't influenced by Mesopotamian sources. The number appears independently in both traditions. That's not coincidence. That's either both cultures independently arriving at the same symbolic number, which is possible but statistically unlikely, or both cultures preserving a memory of the same chronological framework, even if they understood it differently. Let's examine the Hebrew tradition more closely as well, because Genesis provides details that don't appear in the other traditions. The Genesis flood account specifies that Noah was 600 years old when the flood came. After the flood, he lived another 350 years and died at 950 years old. But Genesis also provides specific dates. It states that the flood began in the 600th year of Noah's life, in the second month, the 17th day of the month, and it ended when the waters were dried up from off the earth, in Noah's 601st year. This isn't vague mythology. This is chronicle, specific dates, specific ages, the kind of detail you include when you're documenting what you believe actually happened. And after the flood, Genesis traces Noah's descendants in careful detail. It doesn't just say humanity continued. It lists specific generations: Shem, Arphaxad, Shelah, Eber, Peleg, Ru, Serug, Nahor, Terah, Abram. For each person, it provides 3 pieces of information: how old they were when they had their first son, how many years they lived after that, and their total lifespan. That's the format of genealogical record-keeping. That's how ancient cultures tracked succession and maintained family histories. It's not the format of symbolic mythology. The Hebrew text treats the pre-flood and post-flood periods as continuous history. The flood is a discontinuity within that history, a catastrophic event that changed everything. But it's still history, the same kind of history that Genesis uses to trace Abraham's lineage to the tribes of Israel. Now, let's return to the Mayan tradition, because the Popol Vuh provides details that haven't received enough attention. The text doesn't just say the wooden people were destroyed by flood. It provides specific details about how they were destroyed. The face of the earth was darkened, and a black rain began to fall by day and by night. The earth was blackened by the rain of resin. Their dogs spoke and said, "Why did you not watch over us?" Their grinding stones spoke and said, "You tormented us with your grinding, morning and night, continuously." This is vivid, specific imagery. The black rain and rain of resin could describe volcanic ashfall mixed with rain, exactly the kind of phenomenon that could accompany a major flood caused by climate catastrophe. The detail about objects speaking, dogs, grinding stones, pottery jars, this is obviously mythological personification. But beneath the mythological overlay is a description of a civilization destroyed suddenly, with survivors experiencing trauma severe enough that it entered their cultural memory in heightened, dramatized form. The Popol Vuh also specifies that the wooden people had no blood, they had no substance, they had no moisture, they had no grease. In Mayan cosmology, blood and substance are what make beings fully human. The wooden people lacked these qualities. They were incomplete, proto-human. This maps onto the Sumerian concept of Lulu, the primitive humans created to serve before the flood. Different mythology, different cultural expression, but the same conceptual framework. The pre-flood inhabitants weren't quite the same as current humanity. And then, the Mayan texts describe current humans being created from maize, from corn. This is clearly mythological in expression. But maize cultivation is what allowed Mayan civilization to develop. It's the agricultural foundation of their culture. So the creation from maize could be read as, current Mayan civilization began when agriculture was established, when humans learned to cultivate maize systematically, when civilization became possible, which is, in its own way, another description of the same transition, from one form of existence to another, marked by a catastrophe, followed by the establishment of current human culture. The pattern holds across all these traditions. 1. Pre-current inhabitants, Sumerian pre-flood kings, Egyptian Shemsu-Hor, Hindu Satyayuga inhabitants, Hebrew pre-flood patriarchs, Mayan wooden people. 2. These pre-current inhabitants had different characteristics, longer lifespans, direct divine connection, incomplete humanity. 3. A catastrophic flood marked the transition. 4. Current humanity emerged after the catastrophe. 5. Current civilization inherited something from the pre-catastrophe period, Sumerian Me, Egyptian wisdom, Hindu Vedas, Hebrew covenant, Mayan maize cultivation. That's not just cultures have flood stories. That's a specific, detailed, multi-element pattern appearing across cultures with no contact. Either this is an impossible coincidence, multiple cultures independently inventing the same complex narrative structure, or this is institutional memory of real events, preserved through different cultural lenses. The evidence increasingly points toward the latter, because independent invention would show more variation. If these were just creative stories, different cultures would emphasize different elements. Some would focus on divine punishment, others on cosmic renewal, others on moral lessons. But instead, they all preserve the same basic chronology. Before time with different inhabitants, catastrophic water boundary, after time with current humanity, inheritance of previous knowledge. That consistency suggests memory, not invention. Degraded memory, certainly. Memories filtered through thousands of years and multiple retellings. Memories overlaid with cultural interpretations and theological frameworks. But memory, nonetheless. Memory of a time when civilization existed under different conditions. Memory of a catastrophe that ended that period. Memory of a rebuilding afterward. Memory of knowledge and systems that survived the transition. The king list in Mesopotamia. The Turin Canon in Egypt, the Puranas in India, Genesis in the Hebrew tradition, the Popol Vuh in Mesoamerica, all preserving the same memory, all marking the same boundary, all insisting that human history as we know it began after something else ended. The numbers are one mystery. But there's another layer to examine, the language itself. What the cuneiform actually calls these pre-flood rulers, because the terminology shifts precisely at the flood boundary. And that shift tells us something important about how ancient scribes understood what they were recording. In Sumerian cuneiform, there are two primary words for ruler. The first is en, written. It's usually translated as lord or priest king. The term carries religious and administrative authority. An en is someone who holds office through divine appointment, someone who serves as an intermediary between heaven and earth. The second is lugal, written. It's usually translated as king, but literally means big man or great man. A lugal is a human ruler, someone who holds power through political authority, military strength, or hereditary succession. The distinction matters because the king list uses these terms differently before and after the flood. Pre-flood rulers are consistently called en. Post-flood rulers increasingly become lugal. The shift happens at the boundary. Before the flood, kingship is described as being lowered from heaven, and the rulers who exercise it are en, divinely appointed administrators. After the flood, kingship is restored, and the rulers who exercise it progressively become lugal, human political leaders. The language tracks a transition from one type of governance to another. This isn't a subtle difference that requires deep linguistic analysis to detect. It's right there in the cuneiform. The scribes who created the king list were documenting a change in the nature of rulership itself. Not just who ruled, but what kind of ruler they were. Now, let's look at another phrase that appears repeatedly in these texts. Nam lugal anta ed de'aba. This is usually translated as when kingship was lowered from heaven, or after kingship descended from heaven. The phrase opens the Sumerian king list. It appears in the Eridu Genesis. It shows up in multiple other cuneiform texts dealing with the establishment of civilization. But let's examine the actual words. Nam lugal means kingship, the office, the function, the institution of rulership. Anta means from heaven, or from the sky. Ed de'aba is where it gets interesting. Ed de is a verb that means to descend, to lower, or to bring down. It describes physical movement from a higher place to a lower place. This is not a metaphorical verb. When the Sumerians wanted to say something metaphorical like wisdom came to the king, they used different grammatical structures. When they used ed de, they meant actual physical descent. The phrase describes kingship as an object or system that was physically moved from one location, heaven or sky, to another location, earth. Not the concept of kingship was revealed to humanity. Not humans developed the idea of having kings. But kingship was brought down from the sky and placed on earth. The language is concrete, material, physical, and it appears consistently across multiple texts, always using the same verb, always describing the same directional movement, from above to below. This should make us uncomfortable, because if we take the language at face value, it's not describing the natural evolution of human political systems. It's describing a transfer, an installation, a system being brought from one place and implemented in another. The scribes had the vocabulary to describe abstract concepts. They wrote extensively about justice, wisdom, truth, order. All abstract ideas they handled with sophisticated grammatical structures. But when they described the origin of kingship, they used the grammar of physical objects being moved through space. Why? Either the scribes were using elaborate metaphor in a context where everything else is concrete bureaucratic language, which seems inconsistent, or they were describing something they believed literally happened. A physical transfer of administrative systems from one group to another, from the divinely appointed administrators, to the lugal, human rulers. Hold that thought. Let's examine another text. The Eridu Genesis tablet, which we mentioned earlier, contains a fascinating passage about the pre-flood world. The tablet is damaged, but the surviving portions describe the establishment of civilization in very specific terms. It mentions me, written. The word me is one of the most difficult terms in Sumerian to translate accurately. Scholars usually render it as divine powers, or divine decrees, or divine attributes, but that's interpretation, not translation. The actual Sumerian texts describe me as concrete, transferable objects that can be counted, listed, stolen, moved from place to place, and housed in specific locations. The most detailed description comes from a text called Inanna and Enki, the transfer of the arts of civilization from Eridu to Uruk. In this text, the goddess Inanna visits the god Enki in Eridu. Enki gets drunk and gives Inanna over 100 me. The text lists them: the me of kingship, the me of godship, the noble and enduring crown, the throne of kingship, the exalted scepter, the noble me of shepherding, the me of kingship, the me of truth, descent into the underworld, ascent from the underworld, the eunuch priest, the prostitute, the holy shrine, the destruction of cities, lamentation. It continues for over 100 items. Some are clearly abstract concepts like truth and justice, but many are concrete things like metalworking, basket weaving, the art of the scribe, the art of the leather worker, and they're all described as me, as things that can be possessed, transferred, given away, stolen. The story continues. Inanna takes these me and loads them onto her boat of heaven. Enki sobers up, realizes what he's done, and sends his servants to get the me back. They pursue Inanna, but she escapes and brings the me to Uruk, where they're installed in her temple. Now, if we read this as pure mythology, it's a story about gods and divine powers. But if we read it as institutional memory being preserved in mythological form, it's describing something quite different. It's describing a transfer of knowledge, technology, and administrative systems from one city, Eridu, to another city, Uruk. And it's describing that transfer as involving specific, countable items, objects or documents or procedures that could be physically moved and installed in a new location. The text treats me as real things, concrete enough to be listed individually, concrete enough to be transported, concrete enough to be kept in specific buildings. This matches how the king list describes kingship, as something that can be lowered from one place and installed in another, not as an abstract concept that emerges naturally, but as a system that requires physical transfer and installation. And here's where the terminology becomes even more specific. The beings associated with these me, with the establishment and administration of pre-flood civilization, are called the Anunnaki. Let's look at that term carefully. In cuneiform, Anunnaki is written, let's break it down sign by sign. Dingir, divine determinative, indicates the word refers to deities or divine beings. A, water, seed, or from whose, none. Prince, noble, or lord, nos, na. Stone, firmness, or related to descent. The most common scholarly translation is princely offspring, or those of royal blood. But another reading, preserved in later Akkadian glosses, translates it as those who from heaven to earth came. The term appears over 140 times in the Sumerian corpus, and its usage is remarkably consistent. The Anunnaki are described as judges, administrators, decreers of fate, establishers of divine offices, those who set the me in place. They're not described as creators of the universe or cosmic forces. They're described in administrative and judicial terms. They make decisions. They assign roles. They establish procedures. They judge disputes. The language used for the Anunnaki is the language of governance, not theology. And here's the pattern that emerges when you track Anunnaki references across multiple texts. In pre-flood texts, the Anunnaki are described as actively present, making decisions, administering systems, directly involved in human affairs. In post-flood texts, the Anunnaki are increasingly described as distant, their decisions made in heavenly councils far removed from Earth. With humans managing day-to-day governance, the transition happens at the flood boundary. Before, direct administration by the Anunnaki. After, human governance with the Anunnaki in increasingly distant advisory roles. The terminology tracks the same transition the king list tracks, from En, divinely appointed, to Lugal, human king. Let's look at a specific example. The Atrahasis epic describes the Anunnaki before the flood in very concrete terms. When the gods were man, they bore the workload, carried the basket, the gods' basket of excavation. Great was the workload, heavy the distress. The text describes the Anunnaki as laborers doing physical work, digging canals, building structures, carrying materials. This is not abstract theological language. This describes physical beings doing manual labor. Then the text says they created humans to take over this labor. Let a Lulu worker be created. Let him bear the yoke. Let him bear the yoke, the work of Enlil. Let man assume the drudgery of God. Lulu is the Akkadian term for a primitive or mixed human, specifically humans created to serve. The text describes this as a solution to a labor problem, not as cosmic creation for theological purposes. After humans are created, the Anunnaki take on administrative and judicial roles, instead of labor roles. The epic describes them holding councils, making decisions about human population, debating whether to send the flood. Post-flood, their role changes again. They become more distant. Human kings increasingly make the decisions that the Anunnaki previously made. The progression is clear: hands-on, administrative, distant advisory, largely absent. And the language tracks this progression. The terms used for the Anunnaki in pre-flood contexts emphasize their presence and activity. The terms used in post-flood contexts emphasize their separation and distance. Now, let's look at another linguistic pattern. The phrase divine council, or assembly of the gods, appears frequently in Mesopotamian texts. In Sumerian, it's Uken-il in Akkadian, the assembly of the gods. These assemblies are described in very specific terms. They have procedural rules. They take votes. They debate. They reach decisions through consensus or majority rule. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, describes how Marduk rises to leadership. They gave him the kingship, honored him with scepter and throne. The father gods proclaimed his supremacy. But before this, there's a detailed description of the assembly process. How many gods must agree? What protocol must be followed? What authority can be granted and under what conditions? This reads like constitutional law, not mythology. The Atrahasis epic describes the assembly debating what to do about humanity. Enlil opened his mouth and addressed the assembly of the gods. The noise of mankind has become too intense for me. With their uproar, I am deprived of sleep. Cut off supplies for the peoples. Let there be a scarcity of plant life to satisfy their hunger. Enki opposes this. Anu has a different opinion. They debate. They vote. Eventually, they decide to send the flood. But Enki secretly warns Atrahasis to build a boat. The language is political, parliamentary, administrative. These are descriptions of governmental processes, not theological allegories about cosmic forces. And all of this terminology, the assembly, the voting, the administrative hierarchy, the judicial roles, is most prominent in texts dealing with the pre-flood period. Post-flood, the texts increasingly describe human kings making these same kinds of decisions without divine assembly meetings, as if the administrative system was transferred, as if humans inherited a governmental structure that previously operated differently. The instructions of Uruk, which we mentioned earlier, is especially interesting in this context. This text is presented as advice from Uruk, the pre-flood king from the king list, to his son Ziusudra, the flood survivor. It's one of the oldest surviving wisdom texts in the world, dated to around 2600 BCE in its earliest form, and it's entirely secular. No theology, no creation myths, no prayers to gods. Just practical advice about governance, agriculture, business, and social relationships. Do not buy a donkey which brays. It will split your harvest. Do not locate a field on a road. Do not guarantee anything. If you do, that very thing will be lost to you. Do not speak arrogantly. Later it will lay a trap for you. These are the instructions of a pre-flood ruler to his son. And they're completely pragmatic. They assume a functioning civilization with complex economic and social structures. No magic, no divine intervention, just wisdom about how to navigate a complex society. This matches the bureaucratic tone of the king list itself. These texts aren't mystical, they're practical. They describe administrative systems, governance procedures, economic activities. They describe civilization. And that brings us to the most uncomfortable question the terminology raises. What if the pre-flood section of the king list isn't describing gods in the theological sense at all? What if Anunnaki doesn't mean supernatural beings, but simply a previous administrative class, rulers from a different system, perhaps even a different geographic origin, who established governance in early Mesopotamia? What if kingship descended from heaven isn't about literal descent from the sky, but is using heaven, as the Sumerians used it, to mean from the north, or from the mountains, or simply from elsewhere? The Sumerian word an, heaven, sky, was also used to mean high or elevated. Temple platforms were called Enki, heaven-earth, not because they touched the sky, but because they were elevated structures. What if the phrase simply means kingship came from a higher elevation, or kingship came from the highland regions, or kingship was brought by those from outside? That would make kingship descended from heaven a geographic description, not a theological one. And it would make the pre-flood rulers simply the previous administrative system, the earlier civilization that established cities, developed governance procedures, created the me, administrative protocols and technologies, and then was destroyed or displaced by the flood, after which human populations had to rebuild using inherited systems they no longer fully understood. This interpretation makes the king list even stranger, not less strange, because it would mean the text is describing something even more concrete than we usually assume. Not gods ruling from heaven in a metaphorical sense, but an actual previous political system that was different from what came after. A system with such different organizational principles that later scribes didn't know how to describe it, except in terms of impossible reign lengths and beings called Anunnaki who descended and then withdrew. The terminology doesn't prove this interpretation, but it's consistent with it. En versus Lugal, appointed administrators versus human kings. Me as transferable systems and procedures, not mystical powers. Anunnaki as administrative class with judicial and governmental roles. Assembly of the gods as political council with voting procedures. Kingship descended from heaven as transfer of governance systems. Every term, when examined carefully, can be read as describing political and administrative realities rather than pure theology. And the terminology shifts precisely at the flood boundary, from one vocabulary to another, from one system to another. The scribes maintain these terms with the same precision they maintain the numbers. They didn't update the terminology to match later understanding. They preserved the archaic language even when it must have seemed odd. Just as they preserved the impossible reign lengths even when they could have adjusted them. The data preservation extends beyond numbers to include vocabulary, formulas, technical terms, as if the scribes knew these terms were important, as if the precise language mattered, as if they were maintaining a record that needed to be kept exactly as they received it, even when they no longer fully understood what it described. There's one more linguistic element worth examining, the term lugali versus lugal. Lugal means king. Lugale is the ergative case. It means the king as agent, the king who acts, the king as subject. In post-flood sections of various texts, kings are described as lugal-i. They act, they decide, they command. They're agents with authority. In pre-flood sections, when lugal appears at all, it's rarely in the ergative case. The Anunnaki or the Un are the ones described as agents. Humans, when mentioned, are described as recipients of actions, not as actors themselves. The grammar itself tracks the shift from one system to another. From administration by the Anunnaki to administration by human kings. From appointed En to sovereign Lugal-i. The flood boundary marks the transition from humans as objects of governance to humans as subjects of governance. That's encoded in the grammar. And grammar doesn't lie. Grammar reflects how speakers understand relationships, agency, and causation. The grammatical shift at the flood boundary reflects a real shift in how governance was understood and experienced. Before, someone else administers. Humans are administered. After, humans administer themselves. The entire linguistic structure of these texts supports this reading, not just individual words, but sentence structure, grammatical cases, the relationship between subjects and objects. The language is telling us that the pre-flood world operated under different principles than the post-flood world. Not just different kings with different reign lengths, but a different system of governance itself. The terminology problem isn't that we don't know what these words mean. We have good translations of Sumerian. We understand the grammar. We can read the cuneiform. The problem is that what the words actually say doesn't match what we expect ancient texts to say. We expect mythology. We get bureaucratic record-keeping. We expect theology. We get administrative terminology. We expect cosmic creation stories. We get political transitions. The language refuses to be mythological. It insists on being concrete, specific, administrative. It describes systems being transferred, offices being established, procedures being implemented, authority being delegated. And it marks a clear boundary where one system ended and another began. The Sumerian scribes who created these texts had extensive theological vocabulary. When they wanted to write theology, they wrote texts like The Descent of Inanna or Gilgamesh and the Bull of Heaven, texts full of cosmic imagery, divine powers, supernatural events. But when they wrote the king list, when they wrote about the establishment of civilization, when they described the pre-flood period, they used administrative language. They described it the way later scribes would describe the reign of Hammurabi or the third dynasty of Uruk, as political history, as administrative succession, as governmental transitions. The tone never changes throughout the king list. Pre-flood entries read exactly like post-flood entries. Same format. Same terminology structure. Same bureaucratic precision. The only thing that changes is the numbers, and the specific terms for the type of ruler. In before the flood. Lugal after. Direct Anunnaki administration before. Human self-governance after. Kingship descended initially. Kingship restored after interruption. The language tracks a transition, a handoff, a transfer of administrative authority from one system to another. And the flood marks the point where that transfer was forced, where the old system ended abruptly and the new system had to begin, inheriting structures and procedures it hadn't created, but now had to maintain. This is what makes the Sumerian king list so persistently strange. It's not strange because it includes mythology. Most ancient cultures had origin myths. It's strange because it refuses to be mythological. It insists on being a record, a chronicle, a ledger of transitions. And the language it uses, examined carefully, read precisely, translated literally, supports this interpretation. These texts describe governance systems, administrative transitions, political discontinuities, in bureaucratic language that hasn't changed across the boundary they describe, as if the scribes were copying records they inherited, records that documented a transition they no longer fully understood, but knew they needed to preserve exactly, because the language itself was evidence. The precise terms mattered. The specific formulas had to be maintained, even when, especially when, they described something that seemed impossible. The terminology doesn't explain what the pre-flood rulers actually were, but it tells us how ancient scribes categorized them, as administrators, as judges, as establishers of systems, not as gods in the sense we usually mean, as cosmic creators or supernatural forces, but as as divinely appointed administrators who held office, made decisions, established procedures, and eventually withdrew or were removed, leaving humans to govern themselves using inherited systems. That reading is consistent with every linguistic marker in the texts. It's consistent with the bureaucratic tone. It's consistent with the precise preservation of archaic terminology. It's consistent with the grammatical shift at the boundary. It's consistent with how later Mesopotamian scholars continued to reference these texts as historical sources. The language is describing a political transition documented in administrative records, not a theological statement about the nature of the gods, a historical claim about a change in governance. The question is, if that's what the language actually says, do we take it seriously? Or do we continue to assume ancient scribes must have meant something metaphorical, even when they used concrete administrative language consistently across hundreds of tablets over thousands of years? The cuneiform hasn't changed. The words mean what they mean. The grammar structures relationships the way it structures them. What's changed is our willingness to read these texts on their own terms, rather than forcing them into categories we're more comfortable with. And when we read them on their own terms, they describe a boundary where administrative authority was transferred from one system to another, where En gave way to Lugal, where Anunnaki governance gave way to human governance, where kingship that had been descended had to be restored. The terminology marks the transition. The language tracks the change. The grammar encodes the shift. And all of it happens precisely at the flood boundary the archaeological record confirms existed. The texts are telling us something. The question is whether we're willing to hear it. The terminology points to a transition. The texts describe a boundary. But what does the ground actually show? Because the 5 cities listed in the pre-flood section of the king list aren't mythological locations. They're real places. Places that archaeologists have excavated. Places where we can examine actual occupation layers, pottery sequences, building remains. Places where we can test whether the texts are describing something that actually happened. Let's start with Eridu. Eridu is listed first in the king list. When kingship was lowered from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu, the city where civilization supposedly began, the city where Alulim ruled for 28,800 years. Eridu is real. The site, known today as Tel Abu Shahrain, sits in southern Iraq about 12 miles southwest of Ur. The Iraqi Department of Antiquities excavated it extensively between 1946 and 1949, led by Fuad Safar and Seton Lloyd. What they found was extraordinary. 18 successive temple platforms, built one on top of another over thousands of years. The earliest, designated Temple E1, dates to approximately 5400 BCE based on radiocarbon analysis and pottery correlation. 5400 BCE. That's over 7,000 years ago. That's before the invention of writing, before the rise of Sumerian civilization as we usually define it, before the cities we think of as the birthplace of urban culture. And yet, there it is, a temple platform. Sophisticated architecture. Careful construction. Built by the Ubaid culture, a civilization we barely understand because they left no written records. Temple E1 is small, just a single room about 12 feet square, but it sits on a platform that required enormous labor to construct, thousands of man-hours, organized effort, social complexity sufficient to mobilize and coordinate that labor. The platform has drainage channels, foundation techniques that show engineering knowledge, careful orientation suggesting astronomical alignment or ritual significance. This isn't a primitive shrine built by nomadic herders. This is monumental architecture requiring planning, resources, and social organization. And it's the first layer, the beginning. Temple E1 shows no signs of being a prototype or experimental structure. It's competent, accomplished, as if the builders already knew what they were doing. Over the following millennia, the temple was rebuilt and expanded 17 more times. Each new temple was built directly on top of the previous one, maintaining the same sacred location. By Temple E7, around 4500 BCE, the structure had grown to nearly 100 feet long, with multiple rooms, elaborate decoration, and evidence of sophisticated ritual practices. By the time Sumerian civilization emerges in written records around 3500 BCE, Eridu already had nearly 2,000 years of continuous temple construction behind it. The texts say civilization began at Eridu. The archaeology says Eridu was indeed one of the earliest complex settlements in Mesopotamia. The texts say kingship descended at Eridu. The archaeology shows sophisticated social organization appearing there with no clear developmental precursor. The correlation is uncomfortable. Now, let's look at what happened to Eridu around 3800 BCE. The Ubaid culture, which built those temples, suddenly declined. Sites across southern Mesopotamia show abandonment or significant population reduction. The sophisticated pottery that characterized the Ubaid period disappears. There's a gap, about 300 years where the archaeological record becomes murky. Southern Mesopotamia seems to experience a population crash or major cultural disruption. And then, around 3500 BCE, Sumerian civilization appears, not gradually developing from the Ubaid culture, but appearing with fully formed characteristics: writing, complex administrative systems, large-scale irrigation, urban planning. The gap between Ubaid and Sumerian is one of the persistent mysteries of Mesopotamian archaeology. Why did the sophisticated Ubaid culture decline? Where did the Sumerian culture come from? Why does complex civilization appear so suddenly with so little apparent developmental phase? The standard explanation is migration, that the Sumerians were a different population who moved into the region, but there's limited evidence for large-scale migration. The continuity in settlement locations and agricultural practices suggests population continuity. It's more like a cultural transformation than a population replacement, as if the people remained but the civilization changed forms. Now hold that thought, and let's look at Shuruppak. Shuruppak is listed as the last pre-flood city in the king list. It's where Ubar-Tutu ruled, father of Ziusudra, the flood survivor. The site is modern Tel Farah in Iraq. German archaeologists excavated it in 1902, 1903, and again in the 1920s. And they found something remarkable: a massive flood layer. Between the lower occupation levels and the upper levels sits a deposit of water-laid silt about 60 centimeters thick, 2 feet of flood sediment. Flood deposits aren't unusual in Mesopotamia. The Tigris and Euphrates flood regularly. But this deposit is different. It's much thicker than typical seasonal flooding would leave, and it marks a clear cultural discontinuity. Below the flood layer, Jemdet Nasr period occupation, dating to approximately 3100–2900 BCE. Above the flood layer, early dynastic Wardas period occupation, with noticeably different pottery styles and building techniques. The flood layer sits right at the transition between these periods, right at the moment when Sumerian civilization shifts from one phase to another, and Uruk isn't the only site with flood evidence. When Leonard Woolley excavated Ur between 1922 and 1934, he found an even more impressive flood deposit. In one excavation pit, he uncovered 11 feet of clean water-laid silt with no artifacts, no pottery shards, no occupation debris. 11 feet of sterile flood sediment. Woolley was convinced he'd found evidence of the biblical flood. He wrote extensively about it, arguing that this proved the Noah story was based on historical events. Later, archaeologists were more cautious. 11 feet of flood deposit proves a major flood at Ur, but other sites in Mesopotamia don't show flooding at exactly the same time. The flood at Ur appears to have been localized, not global. But here's what's significant. The flood layer at Ur, like the one at Uruk, marks a cultural transition. Below the flood, Ubaid period occupation with characteristic pottery and architectural styles. Above the flood, Uruk period occupation with different pottery and building methods. The flood separates two distinct cultural phases, and the timing approximately matches. Within the dating uncertainties of early archaeology, the boundary the King List describes. Now, let's look at what appears after the flood layers. At multiple sites across southern Mesopotamia, the period from roughly 3500 to 2900 BCE shows dramatic cultural advancement. This is the Uruk period, named after the city that became dominant during this time. The Uruk period shows the invention of writing. Cuneiform appears around 3200 BCE. Massive increase in settlement size. Uruk grows to 250 hectares. Monumental architecture, temples, ziggurats, city walls, complex administrative systems, thousands of tablets recording economic transactions, advanced irrigation networks, sophisticated art and crafts, long-distance trade networks. This is where recognizable Mesopotamian civilization appears in the archaeological record. Cities, writing, bureaucracy, everything the texts say was restored after the flood. But here's the archaeological problem. This advancement appears suddenly. The Ubaid culture that preceded it was sophisticated in its own way, organized enough to build those temple platforms at Eridu, to maintain trade networks, to produce high-quality pottery. But it didn't have writing. It didn't have cities of 250 hectares. It didn't have the administrative complexity that appears in the Uruk period. The jump from Ubaid to Uruk is dramatic, not impossibly dramatic. Cultures do advance, but dramatic enough that archaeologists continue to debate what caused it and whether there was some external catalyst. And the texts say there was. The restoration of kingship, the transfer of the me, the rebuilding after the flood. The archaeology doesn't prove the texts are right, but it doesn't contradict them either. What the ground shows is consistent with what the tablets say. A sophisticated early culture, Ubaid, followed by some kind of disruption, the 3800 BCE decline and flood evidence, followed by the rapid emergence of fully developed Sumerian civilization. Let's examine another piece of archaeological evidence, the Yemdet Nasr period. This period, roughly 3100 to 2900 BCE, sits right at the end of the Uruk period and the beginning of the early dynastic period. It's named after the site of Jemdet Nasr, where distinctive pottery and tablets were first identified. The Jemdet Nasser period shows something unusual: extremely sophisticated administrative tablets with no apparent developmental phase. The tablets from this period are complex. They show advanced accounting systems, numerical notation, abstract signs representing concepts. They demonstrate bureaucratic sophistication that usually takes time to develop. But we don't see that development. The tablets appear already sophisticated, as if the scribal system was imported or inherited rather than invented locally. The same pattern appears with other technologies. Pottery suddenly shows new forms and decoration. Architecture incorporates techniques that don't appear in earlier periods. Cylinder seals, used to mark ownership and authority, appear with complex iconography already fully developed. It's as if multiple technologies and systems appeared simultaneously or in rapid succession, rather than developing gradually over generations. The archaeological term for this is horizon, a period when multiple innovations appear across a wide geographic area at roughly the same time. The Jemdet Nasser period represents such a horizon. Standard archaeological interpretation is that this represents intensified trade, cultural exchange, perhaps migration of skilled craftspeople, all reasonable explanations. But the texts offer another interpretation. This is when kingship was restored, when the Mi were transferred, when human civilization inherited administrative and technological systems from the pre-flood period. The archaeology can't tell us which interpretation is correct. It can only tell us that something did happen during this period. Multiple innovations did appear in rapid succession. Administrative sophistication did emerge without clear local precedent. Now, let's return to Eridu and examine something else the excavations revealed. The pottery sequence at Eridu shows something interesting. The Ubaid pottery, found in the lower levels associated with the earliest temples, is extraordinarily sophisticated. It's thin-walled, finely made, painted with complex geometric designs. The skill required to produce this pottery is high. It's not the work of people just learning ceramic technology, and it appears suddenly. The earliest levels at Eridu already have this high-quality pottery. There's no progression from crude to refined. It's sophisticated from the beginning. The same pattern appears at other early Ubaid sites. Good pottery from the start. Sophisticated architectural techniques from early levels. Complex settlement planning without obvious experimental phases. It's as if the Ubaid culture arrived already possessing advanced knowledge, rather than developing it in place. This has led some archaeologists to propose that the Ubaid culture itself came from elsewhere, perhaps from the Arabian Gulf region, or from highland areas to the north or east. But evidence for this is limited. No clear homeland has been identified. No obvious migration route is apparent in the archaeological record. The alternative is that the Ubaid culture represents indigenous development in Mesopotamia, but development that happened faster and more completely than we usually see in prehistoric cultures. Either way, the archaeology shows sophistication appearing without clear antecedents, which matches what the texts describe. Civilization being lowered, systems being transferred, knowledge being given rather than discovered. Let's look at one more archaeological element, the royal cemetery at Uruk. This cemetery, excavated by Leonard Woolley, dates to around 2600 BCE, well after the flood boundary, solidly in the early dynastic period when the king list is recording historically verified kings. But the cemetery shows something important: extremely sophisticated death rituals involving human sacrifice, elaborate grave goods, and complex burial customs. These aren't practices that developed gradually. They appear fully formed in the archaeological record. Royal tombs contain dozens of attendants who were apparently killed to accompany the deceased. The logistics of organizing these mass burials, the social structures required to compel or convince people to participate, the ritual knowledge to carry them out, all of this implies complex religious and political systems. And these systems appear in the archaeological record already complete. We don't see simpler versions evolving into more complex ones. We see the complete system appearing at the start of the early dynastic period. This matches the textual claim that administrative and ritual systems were inherited from an earlier period, not developed from scratch. The pattern repeats across multiple aspects of Mesopotamian culture. Sophistication appearing suddenly, systems operating without obvious developmental phases, technologies and knowledge appearing more advanced than the apparent experience level of the culture would predict. Standard archaeology explains this through trade, cultural exchange, gradual development that leaves no archaeological trace, or simply acknowledges that our evidence is incomplete. But the texts offer a different explanation. These systems weren't developed locally. They were inherited. They were transferred. They were taught. The me were given. Kingship was lowered. The Anunnaki established the systems. Then the flood came. Then kingship was restored, and humans maintained what they'd been taught. The archaeology can't prove this interpretation. But here's what the archaeology does show. 1. The cities listed as pre-flood in the king list are real and show early sophisticated occupation too. There's evidence of major flooding at several sites around the period the texts describe. 3. There's a cultural discontinuity in southern Mesopotamia around 3800–3500 BCE 4. Sophisticated systems appear rapidly after this discontinuity. 5. These systems often show sophistication without clear local developmental phases. None of this proves the texts are literally accurate. Dating uncertainties are large. Archaeological evidence is always incomplete. Multiple interpretations are possible. But what we can say is this: the archaeological record doesn't contradict the texts. And in several specific ways, the archaeology matches what the texts describe. The cities are where the texts say they are. The sophistication is when the texts say it appears. The flooding happened around when the texts say it happened. The cultural transition occurred in the time frame the texts describe. The archaeology is silent on who ruled these cities or how long they ruled. It can't tell us if the Anunnaki were real or what the me actually were. Physical evidence doesn't preserve abstract social structures or administrative systems. But the archaeology does show something happened. A boundary was crossed. A transition occurred. An earlier culture gave way to the civilization we recognize as Sumerian. And that boundary is marked in the ground just as it's marked in the texts, with flood layers, with cultural discontinuity, with the sudden appearance of sophisticated systems. The texts say human history began after the flood swept over. The archaeology shows that recognizably, Sumerian civilization, the civilization that invented writing and created the king list, emerged after a period of disruption marked by flooding and cultural change. The correlation isn't perfect. The dating isn't exact. The evidence isn't conclusive. But it's there, in the ground, in the temples of Eridu built over millennia, in the flood layers at Uruk and Ur, in the sophisticated systems appearing suddenly in the Uruk period, in the administrative complexity of the Jemdet Nasser tablets. The archaeology whispers what the texts shout. There was a before and an after, and the transition between them was marked by water. Now, here's where the archaeological evidence becomes most uncomfortable. If we take the texts at face value, not the impossible reign lengths, but the basic claim that civilization existed before the flood and was rebuilt after it, then we should expect to find evidence of sophisticated occupation in the pre-flood layers. And we do. The Ubaid temples at Eridu, the complex pottery, the organized settlements, the irrigation systems, the trade networks that stretched from the Arabian Gulf to the Zagros Mountains. The Ubaid culture was sophisticated. Not as sophisticated as later Sumerian civilization, no writing, smaller settlements, simpler administration, but sophisticated nonetheless. More sophisticated than we typically expect from a prehistoric culture. And then it declined. Around 3800 BCE, something happened to the Ubaid culture. Settlements were abandoned or reduced in size. The characteristic pottery disappeared. The temple construction at Eridu slowed. For about 300 years, southern Mesopotamia seems to have experienced a crisis. And then came the Uruk period, and with it, the rapid development of everything we associate with civilization: cities, writing, complex bureaucracy, monumental architecture. The texts describe this exact sequence: sophisticated pre-flood civilization, flood destruction, post-flood rebuilding. The archaeology shows sophisticated Ubaid culture, period of disruption, Sumerian civilization emergence. The match isn't exact. The timescales don't perfectly align. The nature of the disruption isn't certain. Was it flooding, climate change, warfare, disease, or some combination? But the basic pattern is there. Before, sophisticated culture. Disruption, marked by flooding and settlement abandonment. After, even more sophisticated culture with systems that seem to inherit knowledge from before. The archaeology doesn't prove the king list is accurate history, but it shows that the king list isn't describing something entirely divorced from physical reality. The boundary the texts describe exists in the ground. The cities the texts name are real places with real occupation sequences. The flood the texts mention left real deposits at real sites. The cultural transition the texts document matches a real transition in the archaeological record. We're not dealing with pure mythology here. We're dealing with texts that reference real places, real floods, and real cultural changes, even if their interpretation of those events includes elements we don't understand or can't verify. And that's the archaeological silence that speaks volumes. The ground doesn't tell us who the Anunnaki were. It doesn't tell us what the me actually were. It doesn't tell us how to interpret 800-year reigns. But it does tell us that something happened in southern Mesopotamia around the period these texts describe, that sophisticated culture existed before the disruption, that flooding occurred, that new cultural forms emerged after the disruption. that systems and technologies appeared with surprising sophistication. The archaeology creates a problem for simple dismissal of the texts, because the texts aren't describing events that left no trace. They're describing events that the ground confirms happened, even if we're still debating exactly what happened and why. 5 cities, all real, all excavated, all showing occupation in the period the texts describe, flood layers at multiple sites in the approximate time frame the texts indicate, cultural transition from Ubaid to Sumerian. Around the boundary the texts mark sudden sophistication, in writing, in administration, in technology, after the boundary. The archaeology doesn't explain these patterns, it documents them. And the texts, those bureaucratic cuneiform ledgers that refuse to be simply mythological, offer an explanation that ancient scribes thought worth preserving for thousands of years. An explanation that says there was a before, there was a boundary, there was an after, and human history, as we understand it, began on the far side of that boundary. The ground marks the boundary with silt. The tablets mark it with a phrase, then the flood swept over. Both markers point to the same transition. Both document the same change. One in clay tablets, one in clay deposits. The correlation is there, in the ground, in the texts, in the persistent pattern that won't disappear, no matter how carefully we examine it, or how skeptically we approach it. The archaeological silence on who ruled before the flood is deafening, but the archaeological confirmation that something happened, that there was disruption, transition, rebuilding, that speaks clearly enough. The question is whether we're willing to take seriously what the ground is showing us and what the texts are telling us, not as proof of the impossible, but as evidence of the boundaries between what we understand and what we've forgotten. Let's examine more archaeological sites to understand the pattern of sudden sophistication that appears after the flood boundary. The site of Uruk itself, the city that gives its name to the period when Sumerian civilization crystallized, shows this pattern dramatically. Uruk begins as a small settlement in the Ubaid period. Nothing remarkable. Typical village structures, standard pottery, basic agricultural economy. Then, around 3800 BCE, something changes. The settlement starts growing, rapidly. By 3500 BCE, Uruk has become the largest city in the world at that time, covering roughly 250 hectares with an estimated population of 40,000 to 50,000 people. For context, that's larger than any city that would exist in Europe for another 3,000 years. But it's not just the size. It's what appears at Uruk during this explosive growth. The White Temple complex sits atop a massive platform called the Anu Ziggurat. The temple itself is small, about 17 meters by 22 meters. But the platform it sits on is enormous, over 10 meters tall, built from millions of mud bricks, requiring coordinated labor of thousands of workers. The construction techniques show sophisticated engineering. The platform has internal buttresses for stability. It has a drainage system. It's carefully oriented to the cardinal directions. This isn't experimental architecture. This is expert design executed with precision. And it appears suddenly. There's no progression from simple platforms to complex ones. The Anu Ziggurat appears already sophisticated in the archaeological record. The same pattern appears with the Iana district of Uruk, another massive temple complex dating to the same period. The Iana precinct eventually covers over 9 hectares. It contains multiple temples, administrative buildings, workshops, storage facilities. The limestone temple in Iana has walls decorated with elaborate cone mosaics, thousands of colored clay cones pressed into the walls to create geometric patterns. This requires 1. Production of thousands of uniform cones. 2. Development of colored slips for decoration. 3. Planning the decorative patterns. 4. Coordinating the workers who install them. 5. Administrative oversight of the entire project. That's not simple building. That's sophisticated architectural planning with aesthetic considerations, requiring complex social organization and economic surplus to support the workers. And it appears at Uruk around 3200 BCE, without clear local antecedents. The Ubaid temples that came before weren't decorated this way. The technique appears fully developed. Now let's look at another site. Tel Brak in northern Mesopotamia. Tel Brak shows occupation going back to the 6th millennium BCE. But around 3500 BCE, right in the middle of the Uruk expansion, something dramatic happens. The site grows from a village to a city almost overnight in archaeological terms. A massive building appears called the Eye Temple because of the thousands of small alabaster idols with enormous eyes that were found there. The Eye Temple wasn't gradually built and expanded. It was planned and constructed as a complete complex in a relatively short period. The building has a sophisticated layout with multiple rooms, storage areas, and a central sanctuary. But here's what's most interesting. The Eye Temple shows administrative sophistication. Thousands of clay ceilings were found there. Impressions of cylinder seals used to mark ownership and authority. The seals show a remarkable variety of sophisticated imagery, ritual scenes, animal motifs, geometric patterns. Cylinder seal production requires 1. Stoneworking tools capable of cutting hard stone. 2. Drilling technology for creating the cylinder shape. 3. Micro-carving tools for creating detailed images. 4. Artistic skill to design coherent compositions. 5. Standardization of size and format. This is specialized craft production. And it appears suddenly at Tel Brak without a local tradition of seal-making to build on. The standard archaeological interpretation is that Uruk culture expanded northward, bringing these technologies with it. But that just pushes the question back. Where did Uruk get these technologies? The texts say they were transferred. The arts of civilization, were brought to Uruk from Eridu. Kingship was lowered. Systems were installed. The archaeology shows sophisticated technologies and administrative systems appearing at multiple sites in a relatively brief period without clear developmental antecedents. Let's look at writing itself, because the appearance of cuneiform is one of the most dramatic examples of sudden sophistication. The earliest cuneiform texts from Uruk, dating to around 3200 BCE, aren't primitive experiments. They're already fairly complex. The signs are standardized, the format is consistent, the texts record economic transactions in a systematic way. We have about 5,000 tablets from this earliest period, called the Uruk Third Period. These tablets show numerical signs for counting, pictographic signs for objects, grain, cattle, cloth, abstract signs for concepts, to give, to receive, to owe, personal names or titles, place names. This isn't someone experimenting with how to record information. This is a functioning writing system. Incomplete compared to later cuneiform, It can't yet record grammatical elements like verb tenses, but sophisticated nonetheless. And it appears suddenly. We don't have tablets showing gradual development from simple marks to complex signs. The earliest tablets we have already show systematic organization. The conventional explanation is that the developmental phase existed, but the tablets haven't been found yet. Possible. But we've excavated large portions of Uruk. We've found thousands of tablets from the early period. If there was a long experimental phase, we'd expect to find some evidence of it. Instead, cuneiform appears already functional. As if the basic concept, using standardized signs to record information, arrived fully formed and was then adapted and elaborated over time. Now, let's examine one more critical piece of archaeological evidence: the Uruk vase. The Uruk vase is a large alabaster vessel, over a meter tall, covered with carved relief images. It dates to around 3200 BCE and was found in the Iana temple complex. The vase is significant because it shows a complete narrative in its carved scenes, reading from bottom to top. The bottom register shows water and plants, the agricultural foundation. The second register shows sheep and goats, the pastoral economy. The third register shows a procession of naked men carrying baskets and jars, laborers bringing tribute. The top register shows a ritual scene, a figure presenting offerings to a large figure who may represent the goddess Inanna, or possibly a high priest or priestess in the goddess's regalia. This isn't simple decoration. This is visual narrative. It's telling a story about how society is organized. Agriculture provides the foundation. Pastoralism adds wealth. Human labor transforms raw materials into offerings. And ritual offerings maintain the relationship between human society and divine order. That's sophisticated conceptual thinking expressed in visual form. The artist who carved this understood social hierarchy, economic systems, and religious cosmology well enough to represent them coherently. And this appears at the beginning of Sumerian civilization, not after centuries of artistic development, right at the start. The same pattern appears with the standard of Ur, a decorated box found in the royal cemetery at Ur, dating to around 2600 BCE. It shows two sides, war and peace. The war side shows a military campaign in 3 registers: chariots and infantry in battle, prisoners being led away, the king standing among his officials. The peace side shows a feast in 3 registers: servants bringing animals and goods, a procession of people bringing tribute, the king and his court celebrating. Again, this is sophisticated visual narrative. It requires understanding of how to represent space, movement, hierarchy, and sequence. It requires artistic skill and conceptual planning. And while the standard of Ur is later than the Uruk vase, it shows the same level of sophistication that appears early in Mesopotamian civilization. These aren't primitive attempts at art. These are accomplished works created by trained artists working within established traditions. But where did those traditions come from? The texts say, from before, from the pre-flood period. The me included artistic knowledge along with everything else. The me of metalworking, the me of leatherworking, the me of seal cutting, the me of artistic representation. The archaeology shows sophisticated artistic traditions appearing without obvious local antecedents, as if the concepts and techniques were inherited rather than invented. Let's look at one more. Site, Tepe Gawra in northern Iraq. Tepe shows continuous occupation from about 5000 BCE to 1500 BCE, but level 8, dating to around 4000 BCE, right in the late Ubaid period, shows something remarkable. 3 temples, perfectly planned and arranged in a complex. Not built sequentially over generations, but apparently planned as a unit. The temples have sophisticated architectural features, buttressed walls, elaborate painted decoration, complex room arrangements. And at level 8, there's also a large building with 25 rooms arranged in a systematic pattern. It's been called the palace, though we don't know if that's accurate. But it's clearly a public building requiring sophisticated planning and construction. This is late Ubaid. This is before the Uruk period. This is before the sudden appearance of Sumerian civilization. And yet it's already sophisticated, already showing complex social organization, already demonstrating architectural and artistic capabilities that we associate with civilization. The boundary between primitive and civilized isn't as clear in the archaeology as we once thought. The Ubaid culture was far more sophisticated than given credit for. They built monumental architecture. They produced high-quality crafts. They maintained trade networks over hundreds of kilometers. And then something happened. Around 3800 BCE, many Ubaid sites were abandoned or sharply reduced. The culture that had flourished for over a millennium declined rapidly. The texts say the flood came. Civilization was disrupted. The archaeology shows a cultural discontinuity, a break, a gap. And after that gap, Sumerian civilization emerged, different in character from Ubaid, more urban, more administratively complex, with writing, with monumental architecture on a larger scale, with art and crafts that built on Ubaid traditions but elaborated them dramatically, as if something was inherited from the Ubaid period but also added to, as if knowledge was preserved through the discontinuity and then expanded. The pattern is consistent across multiple sites, multiple types of evidence, multiple time periods. Sophistication appears suddenly. Technologies emerge without clear developmental phases. Social organization shows complexity without obvious antecedents. Artistic and architectural traditions appear already accomplished. And this pattern is most pronounced right after the cultural discontinuity that the texts mark as the flood boundary. The archaeology doesn't prove the texts are literally accurate about 40,000-year reigns and kingship descending from heaven, but it consistently shows that something happened around the period the texts describe, that sophisticated culture existed before the disruption, that major flooding occurred, that new cultural forms emerged after the disruption, and that these new forms often showed surprising sophistication without clear local origins. The ground doesn't contradict the texts. In key ways, it corroborates them. We set out to examine what the oldest historical records actually say, not what we think they should say, not what fits comfortably into our categories of myth versus history, but what they actually say. And they say human history. Our governance, our autonomy, our civilization as we recognize it, began after something else ended. They say there was a before. The Weld Blundell Prism sits in the Ashmolean Museum, 8 inches of baked clay. Catalog number AN 1923 444. You can request to see it. The cuneiform is clear. The text is preserved. Before the flood, 8 kings across 5 cities. Reigns measured in tens of thousands of years. Administrative terminology describing appointed officials called N. language about kingship being lowered from heaven. Then, the flood swept over. After the flood, kings with shrinking reigns, progressive reduction from 100 years to 126 years to normal human lifespans. Terminology shifting to lugal, human kings. Cities we've excavated, names that appear in other sources. Gilgamesh with his walls at Uruk, same document, same format, same bureaucratic precision throughout. And it's not one document. 16 copies from multiple cities over 2 centuries, all preserving the same pre-flood sequence, all marking the same boundary, all maintaining those impossible numbers with obsessive accuracy. The scribes of Nippur taught this as history. Berosus cited it as history 18 centuries later. Egyptian, Hindu, Hebrew, and Mayan texts all describe the same before-after pattern. Long-lived rulers, flood boundary, human-scale history after. The terminology refuses to be mythological. En versus lugal, the me as transferable systems, the Anunnaki as judges and administrators, assembly procedures, voting protocols, political language, not theological language. And the ground confirms the boundary exists. Eridu, Bad Tabaira, Larak, Sipar, Shuruppak, all real cities, all excavated, all showing occupation in the periods the texts describe. The Ubaid culture building, sophisticated temples at Eridu from 5400 BCE, then declining around 3800 BCE, a 300-year gap, then Sumerian civilization emerging with writing, complex administration, monumental architecture. Flood layers at Shuruppak, 60 centimeters of water-laid silt marking cultural transition. 11 feet of flood deposit at separating one period from another. Systems appearing suddenly, writing, bureaucracy, architectural techniques, sophisticated from the start, without clear developmental phases. The pattern is there, in the tablets, in the terminology, in the ground. We can't dismiss it as pure mythology because the cities are real, the floods are real, the cultural transition is real. We can't accept it as literal fact because the reign lengths remain impossible. The mechanism of kingship descending isn't explained in material terms. The nature of the pre-flood rulers isn't described in ways we can verify. But we can acknowledge what the evidence actually shows. There was a boundary. Before it, something we don't fully understand. After it, human civilization as the historical record documents it. The texts mark that boundary with precision. The ground marks it with silt. Both markers point to the same transition. What we can't answer, what the evidence leaves unresolved, is what actually happened at that boundary. Who were the pre-flood rulers the texts call Anunnaki? What were the me that were transferred? What do those mathematical reign lengths actually measure? How was knowledge preserved through the catastrophe? Why did multiple cultures independently record the same transition pattern? The clay tablets sit in museums. The cuneiform hasn't changed in 4,000 years. The flood layers remain in the excavation trenches. The pattern persists across every source we examine. And ancient scribes, sophisticated astronomers, skilled mathematicians, careful record keepers, went to extraordinary lengths to preserve this information exactly. The impossible numbers, the archaic terminology, the bureaucratic formatting, generation after generation, century after century, maintaining a record they clearly considered important even when it described what seemed impossible. They preserved the data. which suggests the data itself mattered, not our interpretation of it, not our comfort with it, but the raw information, the sequence, the numbers, the terminology, the boundary marker. As if someone, somewhere knew this information was evidence of something, even if later generations lost the context to understand what it was evidence of. The Sumerian king list isn't asking us to believe in 40,000-year reigns. It's asking us to acknowledge a boundary, to recognize that the ancient world documented a transition, to consider that human history might not extend as far back as we assume, that what came before might have operated under different principles we've forgotten or never understood. The boundary exists in the records. The flood happened. The cultural discontinuity is real. The cities are real. The post-flood kings are verified. What came before the flood swept over, that remains the mystery. But it's a mystery that multiple ancient civilizations insisted was worth remembering, worth preserving, worth teaching as factual history for thousands of years. The question isn't whether we believe them. The question is, what institutional memory were they maintaining? What transition were they documenting? And why preserve those impossible numbers alongside verified history, unless the numbers themselves were evidence of something we no longer understand? The tablets haven't changed. The archaeology hasn't changed. The pattern remains exactly where ancient scribes placed it: a boundary in the records, a flood in the ground, a transition from one form of civilization to another. Human history, as we recognize it, began after that boundary. What happened before the flood swept over? The cuneiform is silent, but the silence itself speaks, because the records don't claim to describe everything that happened before. They just mark that something did happen, something significant enough that it divided all of time into before and after. And on the far side of that division, after the flood, after the kingship was restored, after humans inherited systems they hadn't created, our history began. The history we can verify. The history we can excavate. The history that connects in unbroken succession from ancient Uruk to the present day. But the texts insist that history had a beginning, a specific beginning, marked by water, marked by transition, marked by the end of something that came before. Whether we call it history or mythology or something else entirely, the pattern persists. In 16 cuneiform tablets, in multiple narrative texts, in cross-cultural flood traditions, in linguistic shifts at the boundary, in archaeological discontinuities, in flood layers in the ground, all marking the same transition, all documenting the same change. The evidence is there, in museums, in excavation reports, in scholarly publications, available for anyone to examine. What we make of that evidence, that's still unresolved. But we can't pretend the evidence doesn't exist. Let me know in the comments. Do you think the Sumerian king list is mythology or degraded historical records? What would explain the same pattern appearing in cultures that never had contact? And what happened before the flood swept over? The question remains open. The evidence remains available. The boundary remains marked, exactly where ancient scribes insisted it belonged.